Another one is it's these companies that are called app aggregators. They've got very popular in the last 3, 4 years, I would say, since COVID. Basically, what they are, John, is it's a company that just went and fundraised cash. They had no prior business model before this. So what they would do is they would assemble a team, some rock stars who've been in the app space before, and they would raise that cash and go out and use it to start buying mobile apps.
How do you sell an app you don't really want to run anymore? Hello and welcome to Growth Masterminds. My name is John Koetsier. Most of the time we talk about growth. This is, after all, the Growth Masterminds podcast. But sometimes maybe you're just not the right person or company to take an app to the next level. Sometimes you just want to focus somewhere else. You want to invest somewhere else, whatever it is. So maybe you want to sell part of your portfolio. How do you do that? When do you do that? How's it work? To chat, we have a mobile app selling expert. He runs AppFlip.co and his name is Charlie Ryan. Welcome, Charlie.
Cheers, John. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, super pumped to have you. You're calling in from Cyprus, which is really cool. I've wanted to visit. Hopefully, we'll do one of these days. Let's start here. Why do publishers generally want to sell their apps?
Yeah, so publishers might want to sell their apps, for example, because they might have a change in strategy. That could be they're targeting a certain sort of category and they want to build out a portfolio there. By taking that approach, there's a lot of benefits they can have from it, things like cross marketing, things by getting a lot of synergies by focusing on a certain category. And you see it with some publishers, they might have started broad. They were developing a lot of different apps across different categories. And then from that, they see, okay, if we actually just get a bit more specific here in the apps that we acquire and the apps that we build ourselves, we can get a lot of synergies from that, and it will be more beneficial for us as a company in terms of growth and generating more revenue. So from that, you might see they will want to offload some of those ones they built in the early days where they're not giving them much attention now and they've fallen outside of the scope for them then as a publishing company.
It's interesting because you see publishers and they focus, let's say, on casino apps, or they focus on a certain type of casual game or something like that. And that's probably, maybe that's not even where they started. They started and they did 5 different things, 10 different things, and sort of one hit pay dirt and started really growing. And then they kind of, built variations around that. I guess you see that even with the biggest publishers like Rovio. How many Angry Birds games are there out there, right? There's a ton. So that makes a ton of sense. Let's look at the flip side. Who wants to buy apps? Who's looking to buy apps?
On the buying side as well, then you would have publishing studios. Like a lot of them could be, for example, they've grown really well organically, and now they think, okay, we've kind of hit limits there, or we could see more potential there in terms of doing acquisitions. So what they would do is they might have apps in a certain category, and then they see there's one sub niche where a lot of their users kind of ask for a feature there, or potentially something around that certain niche that they don't have an existing app in. So what they would look to do is instead of kind of being able to launch that themselves and taking the time there to build up their ASO, get their ranking up, they'll try and spot, okay, is there a potential person who's in that sub niche? Can we acquire it and then we can start cross marketing our own users into that sub niche app? And then the users in that sub niche app, they'll have a lot of crossover with the existing apps that this publishing studio has, so they can cross market those users as well. They would be one, so publishing studios, and I think it's pretty obvious with that, why it makes sense for them. Another one is it's these companies that are called app aggregators. They've got very popular in the last 3, 4 years, I would say, since COVID. Basically, what they are, John, is it's a company that just went and fundraised cash. They had no prior business model before this. So what they would do is they would assemble a team, some rock stars who've been in the app space before, and they would raise that cash and go out and use it to start buying mobile apps. Prior to actually founding AppFlip, I was working for a company called Appic where I was doing the acquisitions for them. And we had that business model. We fundraised cash and we went out to buy these potential mobile apps. And the ideal target for them is they're really looking for indie developers who have a lack of resources and a lack of expertise. So for example, a lot of the indie developers that I work with, they never really try marketing. It's something where they just build a fantastic app, they get very good user feedback, but then they've never seen if there's potential there to scale it with marketing. So the kind of ideal target for those app
Yeah.
aggregators is finding these apps that have never been marketed, and then they would have the resources to go and do things like testing, testing the paywall, improving the onboarding, adding tracking in across all the different events in the app, and then obviously starting with marketing as well, which is it's a pretty kind of straightforward play there from the app acquirer's perspective in terms of it's never been marketed before, so they can get the upside there.
I literally know a guy like that who has cut his teeth in the app marketing space, is an actual recognized expert in it. And as part of a sideline business, he looks for apps that he thinks are under marketed, apps that are pretty good, that actually, are people like and they enjoy. But the people who own them, the indies, as you mentioned, have never done marketing, don't know how it works, don't know what to do, maybe don't have the resources to do it, or just they haven't tried. And so he's bought some apps, I've seen it personally, and put a paywall in a certain spot and just made ridiculous sums of money from that. There seems to be a ton of opportunity there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's some individuals that do that as well. So I have a couple of individuals who are on my books as buyers, and the strategy for some of them. So let's say an app that's monetized by advertising revenue, for example. They might not have many networks in that app, the app owner. And there's a couple of guys I know they would go in and they would improve the amount of networks, so that they would get more bidding and they could improve the advertising revenue then for that app. So individuals are buyers as well, and they could be anything from, somebody who is an indie developer, they've exited, now they want to potentially get into a new category and they'll acquire. It could be someone who is a CTO, someone who's just an entrepreneur and wants to do a bit of acquisition entrepreneurship. So they would go and they would try to look for these mobile apps that they can buy. They would be on the kind of smaller side, I would say, typically those acquisition entrepreneurship ones.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they're one of the
Mm-hmm.
category of
Mm-hmm.
buyers as well.
How do you value an app?
That's the probably the main question I get, John, from mobile app owners. Yeah, it's with a mobile app, so there's a couple of different things that go into it, but you can make it pretty simple in the sense that it's really focusing on the cash flow of the mobile app. And what that looks like then is your revenue and your profit margin for the last 12 months versus the previous 12 months, and as well looking at what the retention looks like on your subscriptions then as well. That retention then you can forecast with those future cohorts what that will look like into the future, and then give you an idea of what the present day value of those cash flows would look like to give you a valuation. As well, what I think is really important there is looking at things like the download numbers and the monthly active users, for those kind of reasons that I told you, that if someone acquires it and they can cross market those existing users, that's going to be more valuable for them. So if an app has 10,000 versus 100,000 monthly
Mm-hmm.
downloads and you're acquiring that valuable user base because you can cross market it, obviously it adds a lot more value to you if you have 100,000 there. And as well as that, I would say, what's the
Mm-hmm.
lifespan of that app on the App Store or on the Play Store? Has it stood the test of time? We're seeing a lot of apps at the moment that are they're these AI apps, so they have AI functionality in them, and they have great results for the last 12, 18 months. But in terms of from a buyer's perspective, it's how much consistency is there and how much can you really forecast into the future what it's going to look like, especially when a lot of these they could be monetized by annual subscriptions, but they haven't even got to 1 year yet, so you can't see what the annual retention rate looks like on those subscriptions. So I would say if you have a good track record of a few years, it makes it a lot more uh, stable and easier for it to forecast for the app buyer there and give it a valuation.
I really like what you're saying there around the couple of years, because I've looked myself. I've looked, at acquiring a couple apps here or there, and sometimes you see things that it looks like it was built to flip, right?
Yeah.
Somebody built something and there's something cool there, and but there's no track record, so I don't not enough of a track record, so I don't really know how to value it and how to say, hey, I'll put down that price right there. But the other challenge is that you may have, as you mentioned, like an indie who developed that, and it's really cool. And there's a lot of technology there, and there's a lot of development that went into it. And in the right hands, with the right marketing and the right budget, it could do amazing. But they haven't ever put that into it. So how do you value that app where there isn't really that many users or that much usage, but you think, you know what, actually there's real value here? Is that like the diamond in the rough? Is that the toughest one to value?
Yeah, I would say that becomes a lot trickier, for example, because for the majority of the buyers, it's looking at what the cash flow is like and bringing that back to present day value and making the valuation on that basis. In terms of something like really good technology or proprietary technology that is not so easy to come by and has been built and a lot of effort has been put into it, that can be a more of a specific case where certain buyers can value that a lot more than others. We've had some cases where we've had apps like that where a lot of research R&D expense has gone into that particular app to be able to build the technology that's in it. But bringing it out to a lot of buyers, then the majority of them don't really see the value in that. There's some specific ones where they can see it because it might give them some
Hmm.
barriers to entry against their competition, or it gives them defensibility there in terms of that offering. But really, in terms of those buyers, like the publishing studios and definitely the app aggregators, what they're looking for is future potential cash flow from the app. If the proprietary technology can deliver on that and it's something they're comfortable with, then it becomes an acquisition target for them. But something where it might add in terms of complexity. I see the buyers trying to minimize complexity because if you think for some of these app aggregators, they could be acquiring 20, 30 apps in a year, and if you have a small bit of complexity in each one of those apps, 30 apps later, that a little bit of complexity across all of them leads to a lot of complexity. So really the aim of the game is to try and find those simplistic apps, ones that even if you didn't touch them, in 2, 3 years, they will still be doing decent numbers. But it's just trying to something that's on a good trajectory, being able to improve it with a couple of different touches around testing and improving campaigns. So I would say, in terms of the kind of complexity piece that proprietary technology might add and the resources that might be needed there in terms of understanding it and maintaining and developing it, that's what could take away from it being an interesting acquisition target for some buyers.
That's super interesting to listen to because I've seen it personally in the tech world where multiple times, in fact, that companies that I've been involved with where there's acquisitions of a team and technology. That's a little different. Many apps are just sold the app itself, not the team. But you acquire some technology and then, yeah, the code base isn't what you thought it was.
Yeah,
Maintaining isn't what you thought it was. Integrating it isn't what you thought it was. That may not be the case in many apps. You're just, as you said, you're just going to run it for 3 or 4 years and milk it and maybe add a few things here and some marketing around it and some paywalls or some in-app purchases or something like that. But yeah, complexity, not a great thing. And if you're acquiring for technology, that's a lot trickier as well. You better really deeply know what you need and what you want and how that's going to work. Um, let's talk a little bit about verticals. What's hot right now? What's interesting right now? Is it anything that's making money, or are there some verticals that are specifically of interest?
I think the ones that are interesting are the evergreen categories. Since I kind of started doing this like 2 years ago in terms of being on the buyer side, it's really looking at something that has a practical use case. So things like your habit trackers, like your health and fitness apps. People are going to be tracking their habits in 5 years, 10 years time. People are going to still be doing health and fitness stuff in 5 to 10 years time. I think it's the ones where buyers might feel a little bit weary about it is things like photo and video. Those kind of apps, they need a lot of technological
Mm-hmm.
upgrades, and the technology is constantly changing. The sort of camera filters you might be using now in 2 years' time, will they be redundant because the technology is upgraded so much, and you kind of need to invest in the technology there to upgrade it. So I would say in terms of what's popular and the majority of the buyers, what they tell me they're looking for is those kind of practical use case apps. So the utilities, productivity, health and fitness, education, these kind of ones, they've always, since I've started doing this, they've always been uh, really a big interest in them from the buyers. And every buyer I'm kind of taking on board, it's really the top of the list usually, those four categories.
Obviously, social is not big there. Social is very volatile and has massive
Yeah,
competitors as well. Very, very cool. I'm guessing fintech isn't there either because fintech mostly that has to be connected with a neobank or a bank or credit cards or other things like that. And those connections can be fragile or needing to be an owned connection as well.
I would
Okay,
say
so
budgeting
budgeting,
apps
which
in the
doesn't
fintech.
require a
Yeah.
connection to Okay, so which doesn't require a connection to your bank account, I'm assuming?
Yeah, some do and then others don't. Some could be just like a tracking spender, for example, and you are tracking your spending and it might not have a connection. And yet those can be, I think the ones without the connections, they're generally more of an interest in them. The ones that have connections, I think there's a little bit of weariness there in terms of like attached to your finances, and what potential
Yeah,
liabilities that could arise out of that.
yeah,
Yeah, and I would,
absolutely. And legalities, especially in the EU and other places like that.
yeah, another one that kind of falls into that
Hmm,
category is things
cool.
like password managers. Like they have a very practical use case, really fits the bill, but then at the same time, from the buyer's perspective, it's like, is there too much liability you're potentially taking on then by acquiring a password manager?
Yeah, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. There's been
Yeah,
some
that
high profile cracks of some password managers in the past 18 months.
true. From the ones we have seen, the retention does usually look pretty good on them, because it is something where if it's not that big a fee and you have all your passwords stored there, people normally just let that subscription roll. So we have, compared to kind of other apps in that category, I would say that the retention rates typically do look good on them.
Makes sense. What do you see mostly in terms of apps that are being sold and acquired? Are they more the subscription type apps? Are they more the in-app purchase apps? Are they ad monetization apps? Or is it a mix of all three?
The one that's most popular is definitely subscription. I think kind of the shift to freemium a few years ago, everybody's really piled into it. And in terms of kind of the lifetime value, obviously it makes a lot of sense from that. So that's the ones that's we're kind of have coming across our desk the most because there's just so many of them out there compared to OTP or compared to
Mm-hmm.
advertising revenue apps. In terms of from a buyer's
Mm-hmm.
perspective, what's interesting, it's definitely those OTP apps that you can shift to subscription. I think back
Mm-hmm.
when I'm speaking with a couple of buyers who've been doing this for a while, they had a couple of opportunities back at the very start of this where there were so many apps there that were OTP and they could purchase them and flip them to subscription and instantly you're kind of increasing your LTVs massively there on the subscriber base or on the user base that come into the app. So that was
Mm-hmm.
obviously you had a great acquisition back in the day if you could have made some of those purchases and just by the nature of the recurring revenue you get from those OTP users. But we're not seeing as many OTP apps now, compared to when I first started doing this. There's much more of a shift towards freemium now, I would say. But if there's any of those OTP apps out there and we bring them to market, I know there's a lot of interest from buyers for them.
Yep.
In terms of advertising revenue, then we've had a couple. Um, the thing with the advertising revenue apps is they can get to such a huge user base because so many people would use them. Typically, any of
Mm-hmm.
the ones that I've seen, the user base has been enormous compared to what it would be like to us compared to a subscription app. And even the free tier users that would come into the subscription app, just by nature of the users aren't paying, so many of them would use it. Um, but we've had a couple of those apps, and then from the buyer's perspective, I wouldn't say they're that interesting for them. They could
Mm-hmm.
be potentially if it has that ability where they're doing advertising revenue, but there is a kind of use case there to switch it to a subscription. But typically
Mm-hmm.
with those advertising revenue ones, I think the developer knows if there is that potential already to shift it to subscription. There's
Mm-hmm.
kind of they're doing it as an advertising revenue one because that's kind of the best way to monetize it or what the user base for it are doing with it.
Yeah. What advice would you give to, let's say, a small publishing house, and they've got, let's say, a portfolio of 15 apps, and they're really focusing on three of them. Three of them is what they're pushing, is what they're continually ongoing developing, what they're actually putting some marketing into. And they've got 12 apps just sort of sitting there on the App Store. Should they look at those and explore if those are saleable, if somebody else might want them?
Yeah, I guess it comes down to how much resources are being committed there. How much are they focusing on these 12 different apps? And in terms of the amount of time that's being allocated there compared to the three main apps, is it a bad use of time? If you kind
Mm-hmm.
of double down on those three core apps and I kind of find with these publishing studios that I meet, it's nearly like venture capital investing. It's like you put small bets into each one of these apps. Let's say you have a portfolio of 25, two or three of them take off, and it's kind of like you should double down on your resources then when you kind of see that you get traction in one of them. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I really find that's the way with publishing studios as well. It's like some of their apps return a huge amount of their total revenue. And if you're kind of splitting your resources too much on those apps that haven't taken off or gotten traction, then there could be definitely much better use of their time to focus on the core ones or potentially get ones where there's potential to acquire something that would be complementary to those three apps by divesting the 12 apps that you might have.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the devil is always in the details and it's context based, but if you are committing too much resources and not getting traction from those 12 apps, then maybe there is scope there to see, okay, can we double down in terms of the apps we have and see if there's any potential other niches to explore there that could be complementary.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I'm guessing that the more complex server side functionality you have to maintain a game or an app, the more challenging it is to complete a purchase.
Yeah, I would say in terms of any of the apps that we've sold or brought to market, the server has never really been too complex, and I don't know if that's just purely from the kind of apps that we've come across, but typically, it might be let's say it's a photo and video app and you do some sort of functionality,
Mm-hmm.
like you can remove objects from it, for example, when you save them into the cloud. It's usually a pretty straightforward process to save that and taking over it. It's not very complex from the buyer's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
so they don't
Mm-hmm.
really, it adds an extra step in due diligence in terms of looking into the costs of that and where it's stored and taking over that service contract. But typically it's pretty straightforward. It's not going to be something that's going to kill a deal or prevent a buyer from taking it over.
Cool. In terms of buyers, what are one or two things that they typically forget or don't think of when they're looking at buying an app?
I would say, things that could be better is not better, but that you can nearly front load to find out, okay, if you're going to waste time here or not, is really trying to understand the complexity. If it is an app that's a little bit bigger and it has a bit more of a technical team on it, trying to get them on the first call instead of the app owner, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to really understand, okay, what is under the hood, how technical is this? And if you can get the two technical teams to come together on those early calls in the first one or two, you can understand if there's any blockers to the potential deal. That's kind of one of the main things for us as a broker. You kind of have to get a certain way down the line on a deal before you kind of find out these things. But I find if you can, and it usually is the technical things that can be the blocker. But if you can find out if there's any technicalities there with it in terms of um, anything related to the app or a trademark or yeah, even the code base that it might be have a certain amount of complexity, that understanding that at the very initial part of the deal can save you a lot of time there in terms of something that might pop up in due diligence that could kill the deal. So I would say from a buyer's perspective, if you can kind of nearly create a checklist of these potential things that could pop up and pre-screen them at the start, it could save a bit of time there.
Cool. Awesome. Charlie, this has been super interesting. I haven't ever done a growth masterminds like this one, but it is something that's happening and it is worthwhile to dig into some of the insights around selling or buying an app. Thank you for taking this time.
Cheers, John. Much appreciated. Thanks for having me on.